Welcome back to the Revolution and Ideology series on the Mau Mau Rebellion in Kenya, as well as its wildly disgusting British response. Today we are going to pick up with the revelations of what took place during the villagization process back in the UK. In other words, what was taking place both in the concentration camps along the pipeline, as well as the reserve villages. News of this began to make its way back to England, and people started to really ask some very tough questions about British colonialism in Kenya and of course, globally as well. By the mid-1950s, enough of the letters had been leaked out of these camps. And again, some had made it to international news sources, some had made it to English parliamentarians, and it's important to understand this forced a number of different inquiries. Most of the leaks, of course, revealed the horrors and hypocrisy of the entire British colonial process, especially within the historical context of a post-World War II era. The fact that they actually had concentration camps and were torturing and killing so many people after they had just, quote-unquote, helped rid the world of Nazis showed, again, some important, I don't even know if we want to call them hypocrisies. Perhaps we'll just flat out call it moral bankruptcy. And many in England were not comfortable with this. One of those individuals in England that was not comfortable with this was Eileen Fletcher, whose groundbreaking work at the time was called The Truth About Kenya. It basically was a whistleblowing work. This kind of allowed parliamentarians themselves, like Barbara Castle and her Labour Party, to launch more and more inquiries into the colonial process that was taking place in Kenya. Many of these inquiries were staunchly obfuscated by all layers of colonial government. Again, starting at the very top, Winston Churchill himself, the quote-unquote Western hero of World War II, shows his true colors here by basically trying to ensure that all of the real goings-on at the pipeline camps as well as in the villages would not make its way back to the British public or to Parliament at this point in time. He was not necessarily ashamed at what he had okayed. I don't want to accuse him of doing it because he was not in Kenya, but of what he basically knew was going on there and basically was willing to look beyond. He wanted to make sure that was not getting back to the British public, nor to other people, of course, in the world. I want to stress that much of the discourse taking place back in England, especially at a governmental level, was not necessarily about attempting to make amends for the wrongdoing of the entire colonial process in Kenya. It was more about now damage control regarding England's reputation, both on a concurrent global level, again, amid post-World War II and Cold War relations, but also importantly, like historically. They didn't want any stains on their history. So essentially, they were basically trying to make sure that the whistleblowing didn't go too far. Again, not because they felt any sort of guilt or felt bad in any way for what was taking place in the pipeline process or during Operation Anvil or during the villagization process and all of the torture and all of the death that had taken place. They wanted the British Empire remembered as some sort of great progressive civilizer of all of the quote-unquote lesser peoples around the world rather than what it was, one of the most devastatingly oppressive regimes the world has ever known. It's during this time period that back on the ground in Kenya that the pipeline begins to crumble. Thomas Asquith's concentration camp pipeline begins to crumble and a new operation is launched. It's actually the operation that's going to kind of be the nail in the coffin for the colonial process. It's called Operation Progress. And it is Operation Progress that basically just takes everything that had already been taking place and tries to make it quote unquote more efficient. So rather than torturing individuals at like one at a time, they will be torturing individuals 50 at a time. And if they can get most of them to just publicly recant, they feel like they have done their job regarding rehabilitation. This takes place under a new leader as Thomas Asquith is replaced by a man named Terence Gavingham. Interestingly enough, Terence Gavingham, there's actually an interview you can find on YouTube with this guy, and he never recants. He never admits feeling any sort of empathy or sympathy or guilt for what he oversaw. It's in a documentary. It's a short, like 40-minute documentary called White Terror. Just put that in your YouTube search bar, and you can watch this individual essentially just show like just dead eyes, just nothing for what he took part in. It's absolutely disgusting. Anyway, it's interesting to note that it is back in England as Operation Progress is engaging in just a more efficient form of, I suppose, torture that the parliamentarians begin to talk about how they're going to eventually, quote unquote, grant Kenya its independence. And it's important to note that in their own minds that Kenyan independence can only take place on British terms and using, of course, a British approved form of constitutionalism, and that the leadership will always be, of course, somewhat loyal to England and, most importantly, England's narrative of events that took place. So let's talk a little bit about that real quick. What is the legacy that we have here? There has been no recompensation given to the victims. Again, most of which were either Kikuyu and to a slightly lesser extent Meru, Embu, and even Maasai. No recompensation has been given. Basically, loyalists and individuals that were willing to sell out their own fellow countrymen to the colonial powers that be, and in some cases even seize their land themselves and committed torturous atrocities themselves, actually remain politically and financially powerful. It can even be tied back to the loyalty cards they were given under English colonial rule that granted them access to these resources. And yet, underground, a decades-long heroic legacy, especially in the Kikuyu tribe, is lauded the world over because the Mau Mau were the resistance fighters, and although some might argue the Mau Mau themselves did not heroically march into Nairobi and liberate it, it was their actions that motivated, of course, the independence process and got people even back in England talking about, okay, I think this colonialism needs to end. In terms of other important legacies that we must note, especially when we consider how the British colonial process in Kenya can be juxtaposed with other parts of the legacy that we must discuss, is how we frame the English colonization of Kenya, and of course how it ended with torture and death. In terms of casualty count, we must understand that as many as 300,000 Kenyans were killed just in that last decade of British colonization. In fact, our source on this is an Asian lawyer named Fitz de Sousa. He says, and I quote, "By the end, I would say there were several 100,000 killed, 100 easily, though more like 200,000 to 300,000. All these people just never came back when it was over. This was a form of ethnic cleansing on the part of the British government, and there's no doubt about that in my mind." In terms of the rhetorical legacy, I think a 1958 letter kind of sums it all up really well for us. This letter came out of one of the concentration camps and made its way, of course, all the way back to England and was eventually published. And this comes from an anonymous detainee in one of the camps. It says, and I quote, "We consider this the most brutal and inhuman treatment ever compared to the Nazi concentration camp. As we have nowhere to appeal, we now appeal to the High Court of World Public Opinion." Finally, after a long and drawn-out legislative process, while more and more Kikuyu were dying, on December 12th of 1963, Kenya was formally granted its independence, and immediately put into leadership were former nationalist leaders that were willing to negotiate with the British, cover up the past, and attempt to set Kenya on a course that would be acceptable to British sensibilities.